Hello, friends. We are back of episode 231 of the Our Weekly Highlights podcast. If you're new to the show, this is the weekly podcast where we talk about the excellent highlights and other additional resources that have been shared in this week's issue of Our Weekly, which you can find at ourweekly.org. My name is Eric Nance, and I'm delighted that you join us from wherever you are around the world. There's a lot going on in the world these days, especially for those of you football fans out there with the World Cup happening as we speak. But this time I am unfortunately solo. My usual co-host Mike Thomas is out on business this week, but in any event, I wanted to keep the lights on, so to speak, and get you an episode out this week with some of the great highlights we have to talk about here. So with that, we'll dive right into it, shall we? And as usual, we have a rotating curator for the issue. And in this week, our curator was Sam Palmer. And as always, he had tremendous help from our fellow Our Weekly team members and contributors like all of you around the world with your poll requests and other wonderful suggestions. Well, you might say it's almost become cliche or a meme at this point. If you blink too much in the world of AI, you may have missed something in terms of how fast things move. It's not just how fast things are moving from the frontier providers. It also impacts the tooling that's built around the models. Lots of things we learn along the way. And iteration has become almost a mainstay at this point. And of course, I'm not the only one feeling this. Some of the very companies and software engineers that we see, being very prevalent in the art community are also seeing this same workflow happen and learning along the way. As one of those key examples is the Posit organization themselves. You by now know that they have been venturing into the world of AI with some recent tooling, and there's been quite an evolution in the tooling that they offer. And in this first highlight, we're going to take a bit of an opinionated look at that. And when I say opinionated, it is from one of the chief architects of these tooling, who is definitely more than qualified to talk about this because he's been at the forefront of many of it. The author of this post is Joe Chang himself, CTO at Posit. It's the head of the Shiny team and much more in the world of AI recently. And the post is titled, A Brief and Biased History of Posit Data Science Agents. So, if you've been following this space, and it's kind of hard not to at this point, you may know that in the world of R and data science that Posit has offered what now is more than one version of an agent that you can use for your data science workflows. And right now, it has landed on the Posit Assistant. But it didn't just come out of thin air. As I mentioned, there was an evolution in this, and we're going to walk through this in this highlight here. The first venture in terms of building an agent fit for data science that the Posit team embarked on was the Positron Assistant. As you may be aware, it was a couple years ago now that Posit had brought forward the Positron IDE as kind of the next generation of a data science IDE that's been positioned to help teams in multilingual data science workflows with R and Python and other languages due to its unique nature of being a fork of Visual Studio Code. Well, with that architecture brought some opportunities for, extensions on top of the code base itself of Visual Studio Code and what they were doing, i.e. at Microsoft with AI. And that was, a few years ago, introducing the Copilot utility, leveraging Microsoft's Copilot integrated with GitHub, that you can have a chat-like interface in Visual Studio Code to maybe help you out with code, maybe autocomplete the code you're writing, and give you a few different options there. That was forked as what we know now as the Positron Assistant, like I said, forked from Copilot. And the experience is marginally the same if you're familiar with Copilot, but it did have some enhancements that were tailored to Positron, such as accessing the features in Positron so with running code in an R or Python session, getting into the internals of those sessions to look at your variables, and also helping you with analyzing your plots as well. That's an interesting side topic that's become quite an interesting discussion point about how AI can interpret plots. That's fresh in my mind from the recent Gen AI conference that we had with our pharma this week, but I digress. But another key feature that Positron Assistant had, as opposed to Copilot, was that they let you connect to other LLM, service providers besides the Copilot service itself, and that such as Anthropic, OpenAI, Cortex from Snowflake, and Google Gemini, and also AWS Bedrock for those in the enterprise that rely on that to surface their models. And that is very, again, tightly coupled with Visual Studio Code. And it was working, again, their first attempt at this, and it definitely made some positive momentum. But like anything, especially in a first attempt, you do have some technical things to sort through, right? And it did seem like with the rapid movement of Copilot, the rapid development, I should say, and it was, being a fork of that, you as a maintainer have to keep up with that, right? It is kind of an unofficial contract you sign when you build upon a other upstream provider. And there was some complexity that the Posit team discovered while trying to extend it in various ways, some of which didn't have the biggest popularity that they were expecting. And it just didn't have the same way that they could customize it as they might have in a different framework. The technical debt was creeping up, and they kind of saw the writing on the wall. This was a first pass, but there might be some opportunities for improvement. The next evolution of this may seem a lot different, but it does play a big role here. I recall being in the audience at the PositConf from a year ago when this was fully featured, and I'm talking about the DataBot agent. This was conceived at the end of 2024, but again, really started taking shape in 2025, where the premise does seem simple under the hood, right? You have a frontier model from a provider such as Anthropic's Claude Sonnet. You give it instructions that are tailored to a data analysis, and on top of those instructions, you let it go loose on R or Python itself to carry out those analyses. Yes, that is a lot of power, and also it may seem very dangerous, but there was a lot of magic happening with this. But they also put in some very important features in this to make it appropriate for exploratory data analysis. Some, user-facing features that were a must was the ability for DataBot to write and execute the code, but then to see the results as they're being generated and keeping that human in the loop. This is a very common and very important criteria that a lot of us in industry are dealing with at the moment, so that it doesn't go completely hog wild, so to speak, on a data analysis without a human saying, hey, let's pump the brakes right there, as the cliche goes, and let's go in this different direction. And then also, not just asking the user explicitly what to do, but to give it a bit of helping hand. Give it a few suggestions that it could pursue that were logical for the data analysis at hand. And there was a little trepidation as this was being brought out. I remember having, some very interesting conversations with Joe himself as this was rolling out and seeing what utility this might have in life sciences. And yes, I was one of those people that says, I see this as immensely powerful, but my goodness, there might be some safeguards we have to put in play here and caveats abound. And he was right on board with that. And you could see, not that I'm taking any credit for this, he had many conversations with multiple people, that when this was rolled out in 2025 in their blog post, it wasn't just announcing the DataBot was available. They put out a companion blog post telling what not to do with DataBot, because this was seen as a very powerful thing in the world of data science. and the models were only getting better. The leap that has happened, in particular the Anthropic side of things, between Claude Sonnet and then to Haiku and now Opus, and for a hot minute, the Fable model that's now no more, at least for public usage, it's growing very rapidly. It is very, very powerful. And there were a lot of interesting cases that Databot can be surfacing here. But there were, just like with the Positron Assistant experience, a bit of downsides that the team saw as time went on, is that it may actually be a little too narrow in scope. There are other parts of a data science workflow that Databot itself just wasn't as equipped to do that you might expect from a more frontier interface like Claude Code or Codex. And that is not just doing the EDA. Maybe you want to turn that into a Shiny app. Maybe you need a more reproducible script at the end. Maybe you want to build a pipeline of sorts after you do your EDA. Well, Databot itself didn't really have at its disposal what it needed to do to make that happen. So there would be users that are using Databot and trying to get to that next stage of the evolution of EDA, going into more production-like questions, and it just couldn't work, so they might turn to Claude Code to finish the rest. So, again, we have now covered Positron Assistant and Databot, and they are, on the surface, quite disparate. Why did it happen that way? At the time that these were built, there were some, key thoughts that the team had as they were doing this. Databot did have a lot of power behind it, right? And it seemed like it belonged in its own sandbox, so to speak, of that perspective, with Positron Assistant being more of the developer assistant, if you will. And then the other architectures were quite different. Databot's not a fork of Copilot. That was built from scratch. So you got entirely different code bases that they're building upon or starting with. It seemed like at the time in 2025 that made a lot of sense, but as Joe mentions in this post, it just hasn't scaled in 2026. A big reason why the perspective changed is, to be perfectly blunt, Claude Code has changed a lot of the game here and what's capable and what people are expecting now when they boot up an agent, interface like that, and how much they can do, what power Claude Code has to access its own built-in tools to inspect your code base, to recommend an analysis, to make that Shiny app, and et cetera, et cetera. And they thought, at the time, this is moving very rapidly. But is there a way to learn from the past and try to reduce the amount of fragmentation that's occurred with these two efforts? And that is where now Posit Assistant comes in the picture. It is the newest version of the agent, and what I'm reading here and what I think between the lines is this looks like where most of the development is going from this point on. Now, it's building upon both the Databot experience and the Positron experience. It is one agent harness. It's got its own access to general tools that are applicable both from an EDA perspective and a development perspective. It's a consistent UI and UX to what people are used to now. It again has full access to the R and Python sessions. And here's the big one here. Not everybody's happy with Positron, and I like it. I have many people at the day job that are still sticking with our studio IDE, whether it's in Workbench or in their client, installation on their laptop, because it's just more familiar to them. It's tailored to R. All they care about is R. Well, Posit Assistant, as you may have heard, is a first-class experience in RStudio. In fact, that's where it landed first. They recognize that the user base is still largely on RStudio, and they didn't want to feel left out, right? The whole AI agent implementation shouldn't just be in Positron. They should have the ability to choose and have a cohesive experience for both. So That was a key decision point. And also, Posit Assistant, the code base on it, is not based on Copilot anymore. That is a key learning from Databot. They built it from the ground up, and they're able to took the code base they have from Databot, extend it a little bit, and morph it the way they need to give the best of both worlds here. And that refactoring is, I think, going to pay off for them in the long run. And I think that is going to be that, one of the biggest compliments that Joe says here in this post is that you as a user can use Posit Assistant as the Databot-like experience, and it won't seem that much different. Or you can use it as a development experience, and it will seem, at least on the surface, pretty familiar to a Claude Code-like experience. Now, I will be upfront. I don't know if anything at this point can be as powerful as Claude Code is. That's just how rapidly they have moved. But at least from the data science side, Posit Assistant seems like it's got a pretty decent shot to make this happen. Now, the last part of this post is, well, naming things is hard, right? A logical question is, why is it called now Posit Assistant? Well, this is the part that Joe says probably is the most controversial. And he wants you to understand this in the post of why he's arrived at this point. He wants it to be, the naming to be pretty agnostic in terms of the branding of it. Yes, it is from Posit, i.e. Posit Assistant, but it's not tied specifically to RStudio. It's not tied to Positron. It is just an assistant with an agent under the hood. So it should just be boring in that sense. This one, I definitely resonate with this next point. The word agent is thrown around way too much by, frankly, a lot of people that don't really know what an agent actually is. And the last thing that Joe and the team wanted to do is jump on that fragmentation of that term being used in many, many places. It probably doesn't work that way. So having the assistant, that's a general term. People get right away, hopefully, what that means. It's assisting you with your development. You can take that in whatever direction you like. And I do think that is a very important feature. Now, there is, of course, a little bit of confusion right now because, as I mentioned, the first two are still around. I do think in the future, according to this, is that Positron Assistant, I should say, will likely be phased out at some point. They're just not quite done with that transition yet. And then this whole fragmentation of, wait, I'm in Positron. Should I use Positron Assistant or Posit Assistant? I guess that will, over time, be rectified, but it's going to be a little bit longer as many of these software projects can go. I personally have not tried Posit Assistant yet. It's on my list to try it. There are some things you have to be aware of if you want to sign up for that. They do have a subscription model if you are trying to run this in an open source fashion. They do have the ability to choose a Gemini focused model that would be a lot less cost for your running, but that is something that you want to keep in mind. So it'll be interesting to hear from you in the audience. Are you turning to Posit Assistant? Are you sticking with Claude Code? For me, it's a mix of a few things depending on where I'm developing. At the day job, we're a Claude Code shop. It's become fully entrenched, and that train's not stopping anytime soon. But we have a lot of people that are interested in Posit Assistant. In my open source work, I am basically using what's called open code, plugged in as an extension to both VS Code and Positron. And then I'm tapping into a provider called Open Router, which will let me choose from the frontier models and local models for a service fee on pay as I go, so to speak. And that's been quite important for both my data science stuff as well as my infrastructure stuff, especially with Nix lately. So everybody's got their own take on this. I'd love to hear from you in the audience, what you're doing in your AI implementations. And it'll be interesting to see the evolution of Posit Assistant from this point on. And up next in our highlights today, we're going to get back to more of a development side of things, especially if you're writing R functions in your next package or reading somebody else's package. And there is a concept that definitely took me a long time to grasp. And just as I thought I had a good handle on it, well, I'm being taken to school in this next highlight on just how the additional flexibility that this special type of parameter provides to you in your functions, and that is what is affectionately known as the 3 dots. You might say 3 small dots. That is a way to give your function additional parameters that you don't necessarily define up front, but you can do some pretty clever things with. And it gets to be pretty interesting when you either build that from scratch in a new function, or you're trying to update an existing function that maybe has a lot of history behind it to make it more flexible. And this next highlight that's talking about this great feature is coming to us from the Syncra blog. And we have a who's who of the authors of this. Maal Salman, of course, former curator at R Weekly, David Shook, and Kiro Muir, all from Syncra. And this highlight is entitled 3 Small Dots for More Readable Code. And you may have seen this pattern talked about in other places, but you also may have seen some opinions on what to do with this. So, in fact, this post leads off with one of the design choices or in the guidelines in the Tidyverse design guide by Hadley Wickham and the rest of the Tidyverse team at Posit. And they say specifically, put the 3 dots after your required arguments. And this post is highlighting just what it is like to put that advice in practice. The first part of this post is talking about, well, just why is that important? Well, it helps you achieve a couple of key goals here. First of all, you can let users name those optional arguments, that you can read so that it's pretty, easy to read if you're a reviewer of the code. That is very helpful. And in fact, I'm one of those people. Almost no matter what, I name my arguments because I don't see any downside to it, even at the risk of more keystrokes. Others may want it just the actual parameter value. I've just always felt scared to do that. So I like naming things. That's helpful for me. And the other key part of this is that you want the user to have flexibility for those optional parameters to put the order they choose when they call it. So that can be achieved if you use the 3 dots after the required arguments. They lead off of the pattern, starting off with a function that's within the iGraph package itself called make_wheel. They do a temporary version of this. They have the 3 dots in between a required parameter of n, but then after the 3 dots, 2 other parameters that have default values of mode and center. Now, this is interesting because they say, okay, what can happen if you don't name things explicitly in this case? If you just supply the value of 10, it does work, right? And if it works, it can also work if you supply that n value without the naming of 10. And then afterwards you say mode equals something like mutual. It's one of the default values you can choose from. And yes, you do get that iGraph plot as well. But things can happen if you mix things up, such as you use the first parameter of 10, and then your second parameter is not called as mode equal mutual, it's just a string mutual. You'll see in the post, the graph looks a lot different when you do that. whoops, it's not an error. It's literally just an incorrect result. Well, that is making sure that that value of mutual is, you got to make sure that's not considered one of those optional arguments. So in a real version of this function, they leverage the rlang check dots empty, as well as some additional checks here in this function to make sure that A, have the dots been parsed, and then within this is going to enforce the user that for that second argument after the mandatory end argument at the top, if they don't name it, like in that hypothetical example we just said, it's going to error out with an informative message that they build in here. Actually, it's building upon rlang to be exact. And the error message says that the ... dots must be empty. They see that the ... one is equal to mutual, and the info message in CLI says, did you forget to name an argument? That is nice. Instead of giving the incorrect result and letting the user scratch their heads, it's telling them you got to name that additional argument after the mandatory one. Now, that's a good catch here, but there's another incorporation you can build into here, is that you can also add this functionality to existing functions, but you have to be cognizant of whether you're going to introduce a breaking change when you do this. So for this part, they turn to a function that they have been using around in the DM package, which we'll get to in a little bit, but they have a simple function to illustrate this called myMessage that has a mandatory argument called X, and then two default arguments of pretty equal false and verbose equal true. And you can run that pretty easily with the arguments that maybe not be named. You'll still get a result, but you want a little more control over this, much like we talked about in the previous example. So in the updated version of the function, once again, they use the rlang check dots empty, and then the rest of the code remains the same. But then when the user doesn't name that additional argument after the mandatory parameter, you will see that error message much like before. But that is harsh, right? Maybe there's an in-between here. Maybe you don't necessarily want to error it. Maybe you want to print a message and then give the result, maybe what the user intended. And that's where they add some additional safeguards here using a hidden gem here called ... length function. It's literally the three dots and the function length, and determining if that is greater than 0, meaning that was there an optional parameter specified, and then using some clever functions in rlang like caller env to grab what's in the environment, and then building a utility function that they have defined here called recover positional attributes to basically reconstruct what the call should have been had the user named those arguments instead. So that's interesting because then the function doesn't error out, but it gives a warning that the verbose argument in this function should have been named, and it will still give them a result, but it's giving them a helping hand to introduce what that might look like if they did this the more verbose way. So that was what they called a gentler solution. It's not a flat out error, but it's still giving them a warning in this case that something was amiss. They may want to correct that. I had no idea that the three dots combined with rlang could give you this ability to give the flexibility of the three dots, but nudge them in the right direction if a user kind of mixes them up with the other required parameters in the function. Certainly the post has, again, all the code examples that I just walked through here. I would say give this a practice. Like it may seem odd at first. Like I said, I haven't gone near the depths of this in my functions that have the three dots in it, but it could be an interesting technique for you to put in your functions. But again, the perspective I want to make sure those of you, especially in production environments, take heed to is anytime you introduce a new feature of how you call your functions, you got to do this kind of in a gentler way, especially. Use like these gentler frameworks. Use it with a lifecycle package. Maybe if you need to say a parameter is deprecated or the way you call a function might be deprecated in the near future. There is never a bad thing about being more verbose with your user base. They want to know instead of those hidden results where the result just doesn't make sense and they don't have an error or a warning to point to when they come complaining to you about something wrong with your package or your app. Don't ask me how I know. But this was a great post from the Syncra team and another technique I want to file in my package development toolbox for the near future. And for our last highlight today, we are going to, this will be quite a departure from what we just talked about. And if you like your math and how to do math with generative art or whatnot, you'll like this one. And I'm still wrapping my head around it after reading it a few times. There are some interesting concepts that you can combine, key concepts of math with art. And this next highlight has a function that can do just that for something that honestly doesn't seem possible. But again, the world of mathematics, in the world of R and data science, almost anything is possible. This post comes to us from Tomas Castrum. Hopefully I'm saying that right. He is a data scientist and data analyst with many years of experience and also very proficient in the Microsoft stack. He has a blog that has been featured in many R Weekly issues in the past. He calls this series of posts Little, Useless, or Useful R Functions. And he has a GitHub repo that has all these functions that he talks about in this blog series. And in this series, or this post we're highlighting today, it is about the Ulam prime spiral. The history of this technique goes back to about 1960s, to be exact, where Stanislaw Ulam apparently was in a meeting, and I know how this goes. Sometimes you get bored in meetings. I hope you're not bored listening to this podcast, by the way, but I digress. And, there's been the trial technique. Maybe you doodle a little bit on paper or whatnot. And this is where I'd love to hear how he got to this point. He started drawing integers in a spiral, but while he does that, he circled the prime numbers along the way. As he's doing this, there was an actual pattern of sorts of diagonal lines appearing in this, and this wound up being a publication after they saw a unique pattern here. But again, I don't quite grok at how this happened here. There is a visual here, and as I look at this visual, I do admit at first I feel like I'm looking at a QR code or something, but it's actually legitimate. So this looks like, if you see the blog post after listening to this, the dots, you see the pattern of some diagonals happening here, and you're wondering just how does that come to be? Well, he wrote the numbers in the spiral. Like I said, he circled the prime numbers, and it's like almost too much. So there's a nice animated graph here that's actually the output of this post. If you start with the number 1 in the middle, and then you write the number in a spiral outward, but as you're writing the numbers, you highlight the prime numbers. If you keep doing this long enough, you will get diagonal lines just organically happening. I don't know what to tell you, folks. This is one you're going to have to sit down and play with. The good news is you have the function in the post as well as the GitHub repo, which we'll link to in the show notes, where you can literally try this out yourself. And like I said, it does produce an animated GIF of this in action. So if nothing else, you can see kind of the fruits of a 1960s meeting that apparently wasn't in engaging enough for Ulam, I should say, to come up with this pattern. I wonder what other patterns are out there with mathematical notations or concepts. I can't say that I do this in my break time, but hey, for those of you who are interested in this stuff, I know especially one of my curators on R Weekly might be very interested in this. Might be worth a try. So as always, the R code is out there. As far as I can tell, I don't think you need to install any dependencies for it. So you can just copy and paste this right then and there. So Tomas has a lot of functions in this post. He, like I said, most of the issues in R Weekly often have one of these functions highlighted. So definitely give that a spin. And I guess if you're in this situation of a somewhat boring meeting, don't say I gave you career advice here. Let me bust out a little math along the way to keep you engaged. What do I know? But in order to keep you engaged on other things, we hope that R Weekly itself keeps you engaged in the world of data science and the innovative things happening in the R community in this ever evolving field, but one that I think is more critically important than ever, no matter which industry you're in. Data science is not going away anytime soon, folks. Claude Code can't replace my data science skills. Wink, wink. But you cannot replace knowledge either, right? And that's where the knowledge of the community at R Weekly comes to play. The rest of the issue has a lot of terrific concepts and blog posts, new packages, brain teasers, all the above here. Lots of interesting insights here. No matter if you're in the enterprise, you're in academia, or maybe at some of the intersection of both. Sam has put together an excellent issue as well. And I will say that one thing that it's not featured here in the issue, this is late breaking news for my dev, skills, so to speak, not related to R Weekly at all. I just think this is kind of fun. I've authored a new Quarto theme for slide presentations, and I'm calling it the Quarto Terminal theme because I like me a good terminal. Why can't my slides look like a good terminal? Well, they can, folks. I'll put that in the supplements of the show notes. I'm quite happy with this because I've been using Quarto for slide making for, almost ever since it was invented. I've been a huge fan of Sheringan before that and other web-based frameworks. I love making slides in Quarto. I thought this was a unique opportunity with a little help from AI to bring a theme that I saw from someone else externally, talking about some AI tooling, and make it available for my next presentation, but also for all of you in the community as well. Feedback's always welcome. This is the first ever extension or theme I've made in Quarto that I've shared publicly. I'm sure there are some gotchas in there somewhere, but I just had a lot of fun building this in my evenings for the past week and a half, so I thought that was pretty fun. But R Weekly is just as fun. In order to keep the fun going, we rely on all of you in the community to give us your ideas, your resources that you've been either building yourself or seeing in the community itself. How do you do it, you ask? Well, that's pretty simple. You just go to rweekly.org. You'll find in the upper right corner the handy little icon, maybe called the ribbon or the AutoCAD, I should say. Click on that. You'll be taken directly to GitHub with the issue draft ready to go for your pull requests. We got templates already in there ready to go. And our curator for the upcoming issue will be sure to review that and hopefully merge it in. But also, we love hearing from you in the community as well. I know Mike, of course, very much enjoys hearing from you as well. As for me, you can find me on various circles on social media out there. I am on Blue Sky, where you can find me with the handle @rpodcast at bsky.social. You can also find me on Mastodon, where I am @rpodcast at podcastindex.social. And I'm on LinkedIn. You can search my name and you'll find me there. And stay tuned. Hopefully in the next week or so, definitely trying to get this out before I go on vacation in a couple of weeks, we will have the recordings online for the recent R Pharma Gen AI virtual event that just took place earlier this week. There's a lot of great recordings I'm going to be rewatching as I edit lots of great knowledge being shared in this space, and I hope to get those recordings out, like I said, at some point next week. Well, that'll do it for here. Again, we always miss Mike when he's not on the show. Hopefully he'll be back for the next episode. But regardless, I want to thank you all so much in the community for listening to this episode of our weekly highlights. And as long as things go according to plan, we should be back for another episode of our weekly highlights next week.